Hello YouTube, it's DasGregor and welcome to part 3 for this year's 2018 Gentoo install. Installing Gentoo in a partition from a host Linux system. In part 1 we set up our environment, got the stage 3 tarball set up. In part 2 we went ahead and configured the terminal and set up the FS tab. And so we're going to continue with part 3 with finalizing everything, hopefully getting to a point where we can be, if time permits, to a spot where we would normally reboot the system and test to make sure everything is good. And so we'll be starting with the network. So if we go over here to this, let's go ahead and move this over to our next window so that we can have that side by side. And let's go ahead and move that so that it is on the right spot. I always like to have my instructions on the left. So let's see here. We did the FS tab and we completed that. So we're at the networking information. So we want to edit the host name. So nano-w/etc hostname. Now the hostname can be anything you like. In this case, we are going to call this, if I can spell, hostname equals, and we're going to call this one LFS Gentoo. Because this is Gentoo in an LFS partition, it will be my secondary OS for a short time while we do all this. You can put the comment in if you like, but for right now this is all we really need. So we will save that and get out of it. You don't have to use Nano, of course. You can use your favorite text editor, whatever works best for you, those who use VI or Vim. And let's see, second, if a domain name is needed, we need to do that in the .NET. Now, sometimes what I will do is just set something as to, you might notice in my Gentoo videos from my main system, I call that Gentoo Envy. So we will go ahead and set that up, nano-w/etc conf.d and net, and we will put in there DNS_domain_low equals, and we will call this, I don't know, how about just Gentoo LFS. We'll just do that for now. That way we know there is something that's there. The demonstration gives home network, but we can have that be called anything we like. So we will save that and get out of it. Now this next thing it talks about is an NIS domain, and it does say that users who do not know that they need one, then you probably don't need to do it. They say will not need one. So we don't know what it is, so we're not going to worry about it. And we move on with configuring the network. So we need to go ahead. It talks about the all network information is gathered in the conf.d net file. It's straightforward, very intuitive, etc., etc., etc. It says the different configurations are found in the netifrc. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go ahead and run this command to set that up. So we can just copy that, paste it, and it will set up the netifrc file. We're going to say yes. It just recorded it in our world update. And it looks like it wants us to go back into the net file. Now it says here DHCP is used by default. For DHCP to work, DHCP client needs to be installed, and this is described later in the installing necessary system tools. If the network connection is going to be static, then you'll have to set up something special, and it shows a definition of static right here. We're going to go ahead and use DHCP though, so we're going to edit that again. So let's just kind of update to there. We'll go to the next line. We're going to do a config and underscore. Now, in my case, I am using the wireless adapter, so it's going to be WLAN 0 instead of ATH0. ATH0 is what you would use if you're using your wired connection. So we're going to do that. We're going to say DHCP, and that's all we need to do there, and that should take care of it. And it does talk about whether your ending there is the same or not, depending upon which network adapter you're using. So we want to make sure that we start networking at boot. So let's save this, make sure we're in the right spot there. And we're going to go into the etc init.d folder. And in the init.d, we're going to make a symbolic link, which is ln-s. We're going to do that for net.low to net. And this is whatever the name of your network will be. In my case, WLAN 0. If it was ATH0, then you would use that instead. And then once we've done that, we want to do an RC update, add net.WLAN default, and that will set that up so that it starts it on the default boot up processes. And it talks about later on what you would do if you were doing it for a different setup and so forth. We can move on. The next thing is setting up the host's file name. So we're going to edit /etc hosts. And it looks like there's a lot of default things. The area right here that we're looking at is this. And we first called ours LFS Gentoo Gentoo LFS, fully qualifying it. And then we will do LFS Gentoo without fully qualifying it, kind of how they did that here with tux.homenetwork, tux, and then localhost, and that matches what we have done for that. If you had any other systems on your network that you would like to be able to call, they give you the examples, for instance, of putting down the IP address of that system and then how you'd like to call it, fully qualifying the name and then giving it its short name. So for instance, I've got a Raspberry Pi, I've got a NAS drive. If I wanted to, I could go ahead and set up short names into here and set up the mapping for those as well. For this example though, we're just going to go with the default for this system. So that's all we have to do here. So we will Control X and save and get out. Now, if your system has PCMCIA or something special like that, this is where you can go ahead and install those drivers. We don't need to do that. We'll just move on. We want to go ahead and set up our root password. So, since we're already as root and we are still in the ch root of Gentoo inside of here, we can just go ahead and do the password command. And we will type in our super secret password. And I know it's very bad, but it's just for a temp. So there we are. We have set our root password and we can move on. Now we want to do the RC config, the key maps, and the hardware clock settings. So we'll edit those files, nano-w /etc rc.conf. Now these preferences, they're really up to you. Each one is very well documented. If you want to force it not to do parallel systems, you can change that parameter. A lot of times I leave most of this just as the default. If you want to be able to skip certain processes, you can turn on the RC_interactive so it says yes. And what that means is you can hit I, or capital I, when it starts up, and it will ask you, do you want to start this service? Do you want to start that service? Do you want to keep on going? In the beginning, I used to do that, and it's really good for troubleshooting if you have a particular service that's hanging and you're not sure if something is fixing it, then you can do that, and then you can manually tell it, ignore it when it gets to that spot, or test it to see if it works. Yeah, each one of these you pretty much can read and look at on yourself. Now, one thing I do like to do is starting up the logs. So I will uncomment the RC logger and set that up to yes. And I will give it its default location for where to put that, var log rc.log. Verbose, or that's up to you. We don't need to worry about that. We don't need to worry about that. Most of these things are really just customizations that you might want to look at and set up, but very little that you'd have to be too concerned about. There are certain issues here about defining dependency services as it gives here. Each one is up to you in regards to what might work best for your system. So we just scroll through here and take a look at things. Honestly, I do not think there's really anything else that we have to worry about. Let me just scroll a little bit further down. I would suggest going ahead, looking at each one if you're unfamiliar. Like I said, all this documentation, it explains a lot of it very well. So we're at the end. So we'll save that, get out of it. We'll look at the key maps. So nano-w/etc conf.d key maps. Since we're using a US key map, we'll leave that. Since it has the Windows key, we'll leave that. If you need to fix the Euro, you can change that to yes, but really there's nothing in here we need to worry about, so we can just go ahead and exit out of there. And then lastly, the hardware clock. Now, a lot of times by default, Linux goes by the UTC time zone for everything. I use local for everything, so I always change this from UTC to local because I prefer that. And really that's all you need to do. Now, if you're using UTC time and setting your clock differently, then you'd want to leave that as UTC. But I go to local. So we save that, exit out, and we can move on to installing tools. We're actually, I think, getting very close to being done here. So the next set of steps it has us do is installing a system logger, setting up a cron daemon, file indexing, if you want to have remote access capability, file system tools, network tools such as Dhcp, and then I believe finalizing everything else. So if we move on down, it talks about the different types of system logging tools that you can use. If you're not sure which one to use, you can just set up as the default. So what we're going to do here is we're going to do an emerge-av, and we're going to use what they suggest, the sys klog.d. Also down here, they suggest using cron, so cron.ie. We'll set that up. They suggest mlocate for file indexing, so we'll add mlocate. Now you can do each of these things separately, or you can kind of add them all together and make it easy that way. So right now we'll go ahead and do that. That way it will emerge all of those all at once, and I can pause the video instead of having to wait for each one of them. So while that compiles, I'll pause the video, and as soon as the last one's done, then we will set up the RC updates to get those going and move on to the remote access section. Be right back. Okay, that really didn't take that much time. So now we want to add those to the startup. So we do RC update, add, sys klog.d default. We'll just do an up arrow to get the next one. We want to add cron.ie default. That takes care of those two right here. File indexing we don't have to worry about. And if you want to set up for SSH daemon, then you can add that as well, and we'll go ahead and do that. So SSH daemon or SSHD default, and now that is set up. Now here's something that's kind of interesting. It talks about if serial console access is needed, which is possible in case for remote servers, uncomment the serial console. Now most likely not too many of us will need that, but there is something else in the init tab that can be very handy. So if we edit the init tab, nano-w/etc init tab, if we go down here to where it runs the agetis, on this first one, Gentoo by default, when it's loading everything at the beginning and loading its services, as soon as it gets to the login screen, it clears the screen and you can no longer see everything that's happened. A lot of times, that's nice if everything is working perfectly and you don't have a problem. But when there is a problem and you see something that gives you a warning or turns yellow or even red, and you're thinking, oh my goodness, what is that? And then all of a sudden it clears the screen for you to log in. You're going, drat, how do I see that? If you do, I believe a -- no clear at the end of your console1 ageti string, then when it boots up and it finishes with all of the starting this service, starting that service, it will just add the login at the end of that and will not clear the screen so that you can then see everything that's going on above you. So if anything does go wrong, you can see exactly what it is and read it without trying to see it as it quickly goes across the screen. You don't really need to do it for the other ones, but it's very nice and a handy feature to do for that first console. So we're going to add that and we're going to go ahead and save it and exit. And that's all we have to do for that section. Now we're into file system tools. Depending upon what file systems you have built into your kernel in the previous section, for instance, will determine what type of file system tools you're going to need, whether or not you are planning on using Btrfs, RiserFS, XFS, etc. In our example, though, we're using ext4, so we're definitely going to want to use or install the E2FS progs. So we will do an emerge -av E2FS progs. And I always find it very helpful to go ahead and install the DOS tools or the DOSFS tools. So we'll add DOSFS tools to that. I'm not using any of the others, so I don't have to worry about that. And before we go ahead and hit the enter key, we are going to need to install DHCP. So we'll go ahead and add that to the list too. So DHCP CD, because we're going to want that. Now we're not going to be doing PPPoE, so we don't have to worry about that portion. But since I am doing wireless, we do need the WPA supplicant. So we will add WPA_supplicant. And we will go ahead and enter and see how many packages that's going to pull in. And that might pull in a few packages. Let's see. We have 11 packages, 10 new, 1 reinstall. And you can see that the reinstall is being pulled in. It doesn't really explain why it's being pulled in. Actually, it's being pulled in because it's already there. So we don't really need to install that package. So we can say no. Sometimes you'll see a package being reinstalled because there's a different use flag. In this case, though, there isn't, so we don't need to reinstall it. So we'll just take that one out, run that again. Now we have 10 packages to install with 13 megs to download. So we'll say yes, allow that to go through, and that will take just a few moments while it installs. While it does, I'll go ahead and pause the video so you don't have to watch everything go across the screen. Be right back. Okay, all done compiling. Now, WPA supplicant actually caused us to take a little bit longer than usual to compile, and that's mainly because it actually by default compiles the Qt widget into there. Now might be a good time to go ahead and install the Gen Toolkit, because I'm going to use that to show you something about the WPA supplicant. And this should take just a few seconds. It's not a very big package. Shouldn't take too long at all to install. But it's going to give us eQuery, which is a very handy utility to use. And that should be done here in just another second or so. Now if we do an eQuery U WPA supplicant, you can see that those that are blue with the minus are not being set up. Those that are red are. And if we go in there, it has the flag by default Qt5 to add support for the Qt5 application and UI framework. Because of that, it pulled in a few Qt applications, and it took a little bit longer than usual to compile those. So if you want to get this package up and running quickly without having to deal with that particular issue, you may want to use the minus Qt5 as a temporary solution to resolve that. And the way you would do that is you would do use equals quotation minus Qt5 quotation emerge dash AV WPA underscore supplicant. And I'll show you what that would do here. By doing that, you'll see that it's going to change the use flag for that since we've already installed it with that. It's going to reinstall it, and it's going to see it says it's green here, negative Qt5. Now because we did that at the command line, just for this one time will it go ahead and change that use flag and compile it, so it'll be faster for you to get started. Because right now we have no GUI, and there's really no reason whatsoever to have the Qt5 install now. But it's a matter of, do you want it now or do you want it later? If you've got the time to do it now, go ahead. If you just want to get it done and quickly finished, use the use dash or use equals quotation minus Qt5 quotation emerge the WPA supplicant, and that will make it go a lot faster because that will kick out about, in my case, about 10-11 minutes less of compiling to do. We're going to say no because we've already taken care of it. And we're going to move on to configuring the bootloader. Because we are setting this up within a host system, there's a lot of this we don't need to worry about. You do not need to install Grub at this time, so we can skip those steps. We don't need to worry about this section here or this section. We can move on. We don't want to install Grub because our Grub should already be set on the host system. So really, we want to ignore a lot of this. So actually, what we're pretty much going to want to do, I'm looking at it right now and I'm thinking, golly, that whole section, it can just be gone. Let me show you what we're going to do. If we go back to the host system, that's right here. If you remember in the last video, we were looking at LSPCI and LSUSB to see what devices we had when we were building our kernel. Now, we're going to want to go ahead and go to boot. And in here, we already have, this is my boot. This is for LFS, but we need to go into Grub. And we should have a Grub config file. Now, we're going to edit that Grub config file. And you'll see, for instance, that I have here my menu entry for Vanilla Linux 4976, which is really the one I'm using for LFS. And then you'll see right underneath here, I have created a new entry. We have here, of course, mimicking this first one, menu entry, We give it a name, quotation. In this case, I gave it a name Gentoo. And then, of course, I kind of mimicked what we did up here. We're using the kernel 4976-R1 Gentoo kernel, but I'm just calling it 76-R1. We put the tilde there. Now, this is what's really important. We need to set the root. Set root equals HD0, 3. Now, HD0, 3 for me is the single first hard drive in the third partition. As you'll see up here, if we look, it's setting the root for HD0, 2, and that is for my LFS partitions. But because Gentoo is in a different location, you need to make sure that inside your menu entry for your Gentoo on the partition, you need to know what that is, and we set that here manually. In this case, as I said, HD0, 3. And then we do pretty much the same thing we had up here. We do the Linux, and we point it to the boot directory, vmlinux-4976-gentoo-r1. We make sure we change also that the real root is dev/sda3, read only, just like there, and the net.if names equals 0. This is optional right here. What this does is it's supposed to change. There was something that happened a few years back where somebody got the bright idea that WLAN 0 and ETH 0 and all that was just too easy, and that it would make it better if you got some ambiguous, very poorly worded name for your network device instead. That makes absolutely no sense. Something like ENPSP01 or something. Now, honestly, I think that's goofy, and I'm being as kind as I can be about it. But if we get back into here, the net.if names equals 0 forces the system to give you back your ETH0, your WLAN 0, your ETH1 if you have two wired connections, etc., and makes it, in my opinion, the much better, older naming standard. And so by doing this and adding this menu entry into your host system's Grub config, that's all you need to do. You add that in, you're good to go. You don't have to do the Grub to search and find and recreate. You can if you like, but personally I don't like those automated tools that set it all up. LFS gave a very good example of how to set up Grub without using those automated functions within Grub 2. And as you see, you don't need very much. A very simple boot menu. This is very easy to make. And you can tell, the different kernels that I had been trying within LFS, for instance, and then decided to go to 4976 because that was the stable that Gentoo was using. And so I went to that because with 4.12.7, which I believe is what I was using, I was having all kinds of trouble with freezes and kernel panics, etc. So then I went to the most recent at the time for 14.13, and while it worked, I still had some weird, strange issues going on, so I decided let's backtrack, downgrade the kernel, set that up. And as we see, it's pretty much the same kernel that Gentoo is still using, 4976 right now. And they have revision 1 because they've added a few different fixes to that kernel. So that's all you need to do for your host system to allow your Gentoo to boot. You don't need and don't want to do a lot of what the instructions here, because these instructions are in reference to if this was your primary position, if this was the one that you wanted to set up Grub on and make this your main area. And in this case, for this example, that's not what we're doing and not what we want to do. So that's all we have to worry about. They do give you the alternative for the Linux loader or Lilo. I haven't used that in many years. If I remember right, though, that was what LFS used to use a while back. And then it does give you the instructions of what you would need to do for the boot parameters for Lilo. And then of course there's instructions in here too for Efi Boot Manager if you are setting up for EFI. Now personally, let me state this very clearly. I cannot stand UEFI. I cannot stand how just terrible it makes everything work. And there will be arguments here or there about the legitimacy of it, but all I see is one huge mess up to cause all kinds of headache. Yeah, honestly, there has been nothing wrong with the BIOS and the way that the BIOS has worked for years. I see UEFI and EFI as nothing more, and I'm sorry, I'm putting my conspiracy hat on. I see it nothing more than a conspiracy by Microsoft to destroy, in their attempt in the beginning, people being able to put other operating systems onto their system besides their forced OS that they force on so many different manufacturers to put on their hardware. Honestly, every laptop and desktop you purchase should come with absolutely no operating system, and you should be allowed to choose what you want up front for your operating system and move forward. And EFI, I'm sorry, UEFI, that's nothing more than another Microsoft piece of garbage that makes it just that much more difficult to manage your operating systems. And that's all I'll say about that. And I apologize. I don't mean to start a flame war in there. This is a Gentoo tutorial. And sometimes it makes it difficult when I start talking about some things like that to keep my opinions to myself. So if you disagree and all that, I don't need to hear about it in the comments. Just, DOS is being DOS, okay? That's all I'll say. We get back over here. It does have instructions. Now, I will say too, 4 or 5 years ago when I got my newest laptop, EFI was on there and there were not these instructions. And it was a nightmare at that time trying to get Windows 10 and Gentoo to load and work side by side. Because like I said, it was just a nightmare for Microsoft to kind of force their OS onto it and force their way of doing it. Now, we have tools and it does work and you can go this route if you like. And I've not done it. Someday maybe I should try it just to see how difficult it would be to do that. But honestly, I've never done it. I don't really have a desire to do it. Now we've gotten to the last portion of this part of the tutorial, completing everything that we need to do here. So you can exit, you can change directory, you can unmount everything, and then you can reboot. So right now I'm going to skip this portion because we can go to finalizing without doing that. And this is where you're going to want to set up a user account. Now we're already in here as root and everything should work fine. So what you'll want to do here is the user add command. So we do user add -m -g. Now they give you the options for the groups. That's that $G means to add yourself to these groups: users, wheel, and audio. If you're going to add yourself to the sudo list, then you want to use the wheel group as that, then that's a good one to be on. If you want to be able to use your audio, that's a very good one to be on. And as a default group, using users is also very good. So for now, we will use what they give us as the defaults: users, wheel, and audio. The -s tells us that we want to use the bash system. Some people like to use ash. Some people there are a couple different command line interfaces out there. I personally have used bash for years and years and really won't ever change. And then once we've done that, we give it the username you want to use. In my case, DasGregor. Hit enter, and we've created that user. And then the next thing would be to do a password and the name of your user. So we go over here, password, PASSWD, name of your user, in my case, DasGregor. Type anything you like in there. Make sure you remember it for later on. It does say that you can remove the stage 3 tarball. If you're comfortable with the way things are, you can remove it or you can leave it. It's not going to hurt anything for now. And then, in essence, we have completed the bare bones install of Gentoo. You are now at a spot where you could log out and test your boot, verify that things are working, and see if you can log in as your user ID. And what we will do is end the video here. If all goes well, then in part 4, we will be back to this area. And what we will do in part 4 is start setting up the backbone and everything for X11. And then we will be installing some sort of a window manager and getting some basic GUI applications installed. We will talk about basic configuration, and I'll give you a spoiler at this point. I will be doing i3. I just really like i3. Call it brainwashing by Irish. Call it a black space with white dots by Dirk, but I still like i3. It has some very good. I went back and I checked KDE recently with Plasma, and I was like, oh, it looks nice. They've fixed a few things, but I miss so much being able just to hit some quick command keys and be switching between 10 different screens, all with their own purpose. And while I tried to create activities within KDE to see if I could mimic that, I could only cycle through them going forward and backwards, and I couldn't see where I could configure it. And I'm sure there is, if I dig deep, a way to make it so that I could just hit Alt and something and have it go to activity 1, 2, 3, or 3 to 1 and 1 to 6 or whatever else, and just have 10 activities set up. But i3 just does it so much better, and I have been so spoiled by a tiling window manager like i3. Once again, DOS's opinion, and that's all. So if it's morning, evening, noon, or night, let's just hope it's not very, very early morning and you're pulling out your hair saying, DOS's instructions didn't work. This didn't work. What am I going to do next? Don't call DOS. That's for sure. No, really. Hopefully all has gone well. You reboot, you check it out. It works. You've got at least a prompt command line interface, and then we will go into the next session pretty soon, and we'll get you into a GUI so you're not staring at a command line that scares you too badly. Although that's all it's been so far. Until next time, bye guys.